So, Khansa, the floor is yours. We can start.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are back with another panel discussion with experts. And today, our theme is about media and particularly referring to media and freedom and exploring topics such as social media. And we're excited to be here with you and discuss this topic with you. We want to hear from our audience. So if you're joining us through Facebook or through Zoom, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. Engage with us, ask our panelists questions, comment, and share with your friends. Before we begin, we'd like to have Ms. Marjan, who's a political officer at the US Embassy in Qatar, say a few words, and then we'll move on to our panelists. Ms. Marjan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can
Yes,
hear
we
you.
do.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Khansa, thank you. Our panelists, Dr. Eddie Borges Ray, Hamad Al Amari, and Marian Al Dupani, and everyone in the audience, thanks for engaging in this afternoon's important discussion on social media and freedom of expression. Each year on May 3rd, we commemorate World Press Freedom Day. It's an important moment because in recent years, press freedom has come under growing threat. Just last month, Reporters Without Borders highlighted that some governments have used the pandemic as an opportunity to place limits on press freedom. And in 2020 alone, the Committee to Protect Journalists estimated that 30 journalists were killed, 21 in relation to their work. And as often the case, more than 85% of these crimes committed against journalists, including homicide, will go unpunished and without justice. Female journalists also are disproportionately targeted and face gender-based violence and harassment, both online and in the workplace. Online, women have become specific targets. They are more exposed to online attacks than their male counterparts and are forced to contend with gender-based violence directed against them simply because they are women. Despite these additional threats, female journalists continue to lead on the front lines and some of the world's most important stories. And how could I not also talk about social media on World Press Freedom Day? As social media can be a place of newfound media freedom and functions as an opportunity for media outlets to diversify the delivery of content and generate openings for individuals to express their views, engage in dialogue, and become connected. Yet social media is also a place where challenges like mis and disinformation can undermine trust and sow divisions. As media space diversifies, both in terms of the platforms that deliver information and the actors that impart information, the world must race to keep up and, in the best of circumstances, work to ensure that freedoms that existed prior to the arrival of social media are also preserved online as well. In multilateral venues such as the UN and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the US plays a leading role in groups of friends on the safety of journalists alongside many other countries. And while some governments have pursued laws that restrict freedom of expression online, many are stepping up to engage and enact legislation and judicial reforms to safeguard freedom of expression and bolster journalist safety. Here in Qatar, initiatives like the proposed Media City project also act as opportunities to reinforce press freedom and further diversify today's journalism. And as we are seeing every day, more and more people around the globe are leveraging social media tools to take part in the practice of journalism and the sharing and consumption of information. With all of this in mind, I'm looking forward to hearing what Khansa and our guest panelists will be sharing with us this afternoon as we celebrate the fundamental freedom that is freedom of expression. I'll stop here and I'll turn it over to Khansa. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for contextualizing the topic for us. Without further ado, let's introduce the stars of today, which is our panelists. Our first panelist for today is Mariam Al-Dupani. Mariam is an award-winning filmmaker and also a graduate of Northwestern University in Qatar. Our second panelist for today is Professor Eddie Borges Ray. Professor Eddie is also a professor at Northwestern and is an expert in discussing topics of media and freedom. Our last panelist for today is Mr. Hamad Al Amari, who is a social media influencer. We're grateful for all of your presence. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to hosting you and we look forward to engaging with you. Thank you, our panelists. So, my first question to all our panelists always is, just a discussion about their journeys, where they come from, what brought them here. Media is just something very specific to be interested in. It's not your everyday job. It's something that you're probably passionate about, something that you probably learned a lot about. So let's hear from them how they got interested in it, and who influenced them, and where do they plan to go from here. So Mariam, we'll begin with you. Can you tell us a little about your journey? What influenced you? How are you where you are today?
Thank you so much, Khamsa, for the lovely introduction. Thank you, everyone who prepared and worked hard to arrange this panel. I'm very honored to be with you today. I would like to say that I started in 2011 during the uprising in the Arab world that hit Yemen as well. I grew up in Yemen. I am Yemeni, and I've been here in Doha since the war in 2015. Unfortunately, in my home country, I couldn't get the opportunity to study media because education wasn't as strong. But I had kind of the opportunity to start over when I came to Doha, and I got accepted into Northwestern to be able to study in a top-notch university that's, I believe, amongst the 20 best universities worldwide in journalism and in communication is something that I thought was out of reach because of my passport. But to have it nearby, where I could kind of finally not just learn by doing, but learn by learning and doing from an educational facility, that was kind of the ultimate blessing. My work is still focused on Yemen. Whenever I can, I go back home. One of my projects I'm still working on is related to child soldiers, and it's a very sensitive topic, so you can imagine how it is hard to navigate, how it is hard to share any information, because you don't want to put the people you're working with telling their stories in danger in any way. And at the same time, you don't want to make anyone angry from the political side, because my family are still back home and my safety is also at risk at all times. So it's extremely kind of draining at times to constantly be thinking of safety risks, but at the same time, there is no way around it. These stories must be told, and I got the opportunity to learn how to do them. I have a platform, then I'm trying to use it to the best of my ability.
And I must say, you're using it really well to tell us stories of conflicts that aren't generally told. And I think what's even more important is that you let those whose stories these are to tell their own stories, as opposed to building a narrative around them and speaking for them. And I think that's why your work is particularly amazing. Um, let's move on to our next panelist, who also has a platform to share a certain message. Mr. Hamad, can you tell us a little about your journey? What is it that you do right now? How did you begin doing this? Tell us a little more.
Uh, and so thank you very much. And thanks to everyone at the US Embassy for having me again. And it's always a pleasure. It's always weird getting called an influencer, but I'll be okay with that. I started off as a stand-up comedian. I do comedy. That was back in 2011. And that kind of opened up the doors to content creation and production and worlds of storytelling and mostly commercials. So I produce commercials, write commercials, and that opened. And then the world of social media opened it a bit more to me, where it was because I developed my own business and work on developing digital solutions, and with the storytelling, it all kind of comes together in the digital world. And the artist side of me is the one that pays attention to the news, if you want to call it that, because it's never news anymore. It's just opinions, and social media is the world that I was first kind of gave me the opportunity to be known or share my content, whether it was my satire, comedy, or my content creation about Qatar, like shows like Q-Tips with Khalifa Haroun, or just, little pieces of art or expression that I wanted to do, like taking a camel to Burger King, or doing a film about the blockade, doing cows and the lack of cows or lack of milk or whatever it was. All of these are, for me, the world of social media is a beautiful mess, and it's a place for you to express, and that's what I'm utilizing it as a recipient. I'm getting sick of it, to be honest, with social media. I'm like 99% close to closing down my Twitter. But yeah, it's a weird world on social, and it's a huge conversation, and I'm glad to be a part of it. But starting off, it was comedy, and I guess it will always be comedy. So if that opens up more doors tomorrow to more content, film, TV, whatever, then great. But it's always about sharing stories for me.
It's comedy, but there's something definitely more meaningful to it, which probably makes you frustrated sometimes and makes you want to shut down Twitter, which I think all of us do at some point or the other. We get tired of social media, but then somehow we always end up coming back to it. I'd love to hear more from you, and I think after this panel, I'm going to research more into this camel going to Burger King story. I think that sounds fascinating. Something that I particularly like about our panel today is that we have a very diverse panel with, you know, experts who are approaching it from different angles. So our next panelist is an academic. So Dr. Eddie, can you tell us a little more about, your engagement with social media? Why did you particularly decide to focus on this, and why do you teach this?
Thank you very much, Hansa, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really, really honored to be part of this panel. Fantastic group we have a fantastic lineup of individuals here. I'm a I'm a former journalist. I'm originally from Venezuela, um, and I worked as a journalist, a media producer in Venezuela for a long time, and slowly transitioned into academia by basically interest on research and aspects such as those. I was always, and I've been always a geek. I really liked, everything technology, everything, equipment. I always have had cameras with me. I've learned all the editing software and solutions, and I always have liked technology. And definitely, when it comes to journalism, social media was some sort of paradigm shift. The way in which journalism was done up until then was completely different. Social media transformed the way in which journalism is done, delivered, disseminated, produced, gathered. And as a geek, I was really interested in seeing how this works. So um, I started to do research a while ago on how technology mediates journalism in particular. And I became very, very interested in data in particular, open data, personal data that is used by social media, automations and algorithms and all of that. And to me, it was really, really important to find ways of empowering citizens to counter these some sort of dynamics. And that's where the some sort of freedom comes in. I started to do research on ways of empowering individuals and citizens through data literacy, understanding information in order to make better decisions. And in that sense, I've been working on that from different angles. Definitely, social media is a driving force in such dynamics, but also, we have had examples where misinformation and information that is driven by other forces are really being detrimental to society overall. So, you know, uh, that's kind of the journey that I have had so far. As a former journalist, I feel passionate about the way in which stories and information can shape society and representations of whatever is our everyday lives. But at the same time, I'm concerned that these dynamics, because they are impossible to regulate, can be really detrimental. So that's kind of my angle, is having some sort of critical perspective, but at the same time teaching my students all the tools that are there, teaching students that there's some sort of more traditional perspective in journalism, and there's a kind of journalism that is emerging in social media, and it's being kind of changed. We can see now there's some sort of hybrid form of journalism that is very, very interesting. So, going back to what Hamad was saying, what does it say that Q-tips are not a form of journalism as well? So, and that's an interesting question as well.
Thank you so much for sharing, and I'd love to see what you have observed in these transitions, in how these messages are shared and how people sort of communicate with one another and how that has evolved. Before we proceed any further with our questions, this panel is being organized in order of Press Freedom Day. So let's just try to understand what this term press freedom means, what is it referring to, and what are the various interpretations around this. So, Mariam, could you please just quickly tell us what press freedom means to you and why do you think it's important, if you think it's important?
Um, yes, it's absolutely important, and it's even more important in a place where people aren't having the freedom to tell their stories or to voice their voices, such as Yemen. We unfortunately, um, independent journalism almost doesn't exist. If it does, then it's immediately attacked. There has been several kidnappings, even killings of journalists, detaining from different warring sides, and there is no clear law that protects them in any way. There are always negotiations, but it's extremely difficult to do anything actually on the ground. So you're constantly scared and worried, trying to literally walk on eggshells in whatever you're trying to do, which is extremely limiting because then you can't really immediately report on violations against children, women, people. So it's a luxury for us, unfortunately.
Thank you for sharing. Hamad, can you tell us a little about what press freedom means to you and why do you think it's important, if you think it's important?
Yeah, I do think it's important. I do think it's important. I'm not a journalist. I know that it's not my place to be talking about that, but I'm always going to look at it from a point of someone who's receiving information. And for me, it's understanding when information is coming at you and when the sources it's coming from and where it's coming from. All of these have a big part to play in analyzing that information and making sense of what that information is to me. And in the Arab world, sources of journalism, if you want real stories, if you want to call them even that, real stories or facts or heart-wrenching or good, whatever the label that you want to give it is, if it's getting the closest thing to the truth or to fact, you wouldn't get it necessarily from the local, like Mariam said in Yemen, it wouldn't be from a Yemeni journalist because they probably die before they get their stories out, or different places and different areas we've seen where journalists have been, when they're just asking a question and trying to answer that question, end with someone's life being taken away because they're looking for answers. That for me tells us a lot more about the places and the big problems rather than the freedom of journalism. Yes, freedom of journalism has to exist, but who are the arbiters? Who are the people who are stopping it? Who are even in social media nowadays? It's like freedom of speech is looked at, in my opinion, from one side. The owner of the digital platform that you choose to speak on is the person who can say, no, we don't want this anymore. Facebook can block some content because it doesn't agree with them, but it won't block it from somewhere else that is the same kind of content. But it is important to be able to give the most factual information and allow people to go and get the most clear and closest to fact story as as a journalist. And I think that there's a lot of things in the way that that stop the public from getting access to the facts, really, because that's what I'm interested in as someone who wants to receive, is like, what's the fact, what's really going on. And most of the time I say that if you are watching Fox and CNN next to each other about the same story, you'll get two different, completely different, like opinions. And it's like, okay, well, who's right? What's really going on? And that for me is the main challenge, really. Getting the truth.
That's interesting because it's just, I guess, subjective because, well, everyone has their own conception of truth. So it's really about finding your own conception to it, of it, and being able to confirm it as being your truth, at least, if not everyone else's. Dr. Eddie, what does press freedom mean to you? And why do you think it's important, if it's important?
Of course, I'm a former journalist. I will always inclined to say that freedom of the press is a quintessential, you know, uh, duty. It needs to exist. It is important. Um, Now, um, there's there's always been this idea that the journalists are the fourth state. Is that the journalists are the watchdog, who are responsible to hold the powers that be accountable. And that probably worked for a long time in certain parts of the world, especially when journalism was, going through their golden era in the 1920s. I believe that our geopolitical landscape has shifted so dramatically that it is no longer sustainable. That some sort of ideal is really, really complex. And I'm more of the idea that before being self-righteous and judgmental and going and saying, this is where freedom of the press is and this is where freedom of the press is not, I tend to think that we really need to understand the intricacies of the sociopolitical environment where journalists operate in order to be able to find the nuance, and being able to see, who are the powers that be in the place. Do they need to be held accountable? In what ways that can be done? Is it the journalists that have to do it? Is it responsible for the citizens? There are places where journalists cannot really be free to report on issues that need to be known. Therefore, many citizens take on their own hands to go and do that through, citizen journalism, for instance. So I believe it is important. It is important for every human being, in order to be self-governing, to have access to quality, high quality information. And journalists need to be there to hold the powers to account. But at the same time, trying to put that into practice is really difficult. I remember, being told this when I was studying journalism and thinking, I'm gonna go and change the world. I'm gonna go and drive social change, and I will uncover corruption and all of that. And then you realize that the business of telling the news is so much more complicated than that. And there are many driving forces and many struggles there happening. So then you realize that that's some sort of is sometimes a real romanticized idea, but ultimately really important and necessary. Sorry.
No, sorry. Absolutely, I do agree with you. I think, it's important because perhaps 100 years ago, or like even 50 years ago, there were one or two mediums of communication where you just had these one or two mediums that the government could very easily regulate. But now we have social media, and as you mentioned, Professor, earlier, citizen journalism is a very important, has become a very important part of our lives. So one of the most important agents for this is social media. So let's just understand the role of social media, and particularly how it is utilized by marginalized communities. Does it give them a voice, or does it leave them in an echo chamber? Mariam, would you like to, since you tell the stories of people whose stories aren't generally heard by mainstream media, can you tell us a little about the role that social media plays in telling these stories, or giving a voice to these marginalized communities?
Absolutely. I want to start off what Hamad was saying. It's always about the platform and what the platform regulates to be more visible, unfortunately. So even with the tool of having social media that anyone can really jump in with any name, not necessarily the real name, and start reporting or telling facts or not facts or whatever story there is. And then it depends how would that person be able to get their voice across. For example, there were many girls coming out with not their real names, telling stories of violence, domestic violence in homes across the Arab world. And it gained momentum because other females felt empowered that, okay, this is not a real name, and we can actually talk without our family knowing. And that kind of created a stronger movement towards the social media feminism, maybe, or supporting women rights in a way or another. And then other platforms will have to speak about it, because when you have significant amount of people liking and sharing and interacting, then it's a force to be reckoned with, and you need to acknowledge it, whether you like it or not. Then you need to give it the space and talk about it in one way or another. Whether you are supporting these females' voices or not, then you really have to listen and try to figure out what's going on. So I think it's always the power of the collective. If you can make a movement and kind of get people to think in a specific way, it doesn't matter what medium you're choosing, but it's always kind of a political game of trying to how to navigate, would this particular story get out or not? Who would be my ally, and then where would it go after that?
So it's really about creating that chain of empowerment which spreads the message, but also makes others feel like their story is being heard, that their pain is sort of being observed around the world, and that it isn't just something that is limited to them. I guess it's really about maximizing the outreach and maximizing the impact of that outreach. um, Hamad, would you like to add to this? Can you tell us a little about your experience? Do you think that social media can be used to give marginalized communities a voice?
Yeah, I think it it can. It definitely has. In recent history, we've seen what's happened in the Arab world, at least, and social media has not all of the you got to give the power to the people. They actually went out like and took action. But yeah, without social media, I don't think it was definitely a big factor, because if it's a group of people and it just gets that traction, and it's a big beast at the end of the day. And if it if you keep feeding the beast and it catches, then everyone's gonna be behind it. And it's all about the shares and shares and shares until it's picked up somewhere. And there's so many stories that make it to millions of views and shares and comments and things like that, where where you would kind of think, oh, why is this the story that makes it? Where there's hundreds of other stories that are happening in the ground, and they're not making it. But yeah, again, it does give marginalized people a voice to some certain extent, but it doesn't give it to all. It's still kind of there's like a theme for it as well. Like now it's Arab Revolution, then it's feminism, then it's religion, then like you don't have to be. Just take a step back and watch your feed, and kind of you'll be able to kind of see what the theme that's being shoved down your feed is. Like I've never actively looked at you know uh, American politics on the senator level, but on Twitter, it's all about that now. It's like just boom, boom, read this, read this. I'm like, I don't care, you know, but it's on your feed. So again, there is an element of, and this is what we do in our work in digital marketing. Like this is, you know, once you understand where, like for me, social media, yes, it's a tool for expression and things like that, but it's also a business tool for me. So I know how to get a message to a certain group and how much it's going to cost and how that whole cycle works. So it's a two-way thing.
Absolutely. I mean, it is a double-edged sword, so to say. There are good things to it, but then it can be used to give a certain kind of trend power or a certain kind of story power, and it's really about who can express themselves the best and get more views and more likes and more of those subscribes and all of those things. Um, Dr. Eddie, can you tell us a little more about your perspective on this? What role do you think social media plays?
Um, I think, you know, I will um, reiterate what Hamid was saying. Recent history has shown that, you know, there has been a lot of social change happening because of social media. You know, starting from the Arab Spring all the way to the occupation of Aleppo, and you know, we were able to know what was happening because, you know, citizens inside of Aleppo were going on social media and telling what was happening. You know, the Me Too campaign, the Black Lives Matters. So, you know, all of that are you know, evidence that it is certainly important. Um, Now the issue here is to what extent those voices, those marginalized communities, are really having the possibility of voicing their concerns. Because if we see recent statistics on the rate of internet penetration in the rest of the world, just recently half of the world population has internet access, which means that the other half has no possibility to voice any issues that they are experiencing because they don't have access to technology. So technologies are always can be some sort of platform for this, but they're also heavily mediated by algorithms and automations, and they dictate, depending on their interpretation of your own tastes, what is the kind of information that you'd like to consume. So it is not the same as in you know, the old legacy media that you were exposed to the same old. This is, it has, you know, different levels and different layers. It's more complicated than it looks like.
Absolutely, there are like multiple layers to it, and I hope that we can unravel it a little more as we proceed with the panel. So, one of our largest consumers, particularly with social media, is actually youth. So, let's talk a little about the role that media and social media in general play in educating the youth. Perhaps we can begin with you, Mariam. Can you tell us a little about the role that media plays, and particularly social media, in educating the youth?
Um, well, it's again, like everything else, it's very tricky because what is that's being fed to young people? What are they learning online? How can you understand what is going through their feeds based on what? Is it based on preference, or is it based on trending issues like what Professor Eddie said? Is it the Me Too movement? Is it the Black Lives Matter movement? Is it happens in one part of the world, but it goes everywhere. It goes everywhere. And then in a way or another, all youth participate in it. Same with what happened with the Arab Spring. It went through the social media. It went through young people first believing in the need of change because things weren't working for them. They're not seeing a future. They're not finding jobs. Um, so learning about how to create change based on other examples or other countries, that is usually taken through the experience through social media networks. Now, does it really work into the best of the interest of the cause? Does it work in a safe manner for young people? Does the state in any way kind of help or not help in making this a safe space in a way or another, whether it's online or not? Because there is always the other force. If there is a movement here against something or someone, then there is always the other side attacking. Um, so I'm not really sure how to answer this. Educating in a positive or negative way, it really is an individual experience from a place to another and from a person to another. And then what is the role of journalism and kind of finding the truth of the truth in a way, not a home, but some sort of a platform that tries to be authentic, tries to be independent to get through. Um, it's puzzling, like it's really hard for me to unravel, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. That makes sense. So, when we talk about media freedom and the role of social media and all of these things, and as everyone has been mentioning, it's always a double-edged sword, the usage of media and sort of the good things that it can do for us. So let's just understand from Hamad, what are some of the challenges of media freedom and how do you think we can overcome them, so to say?
Give me the hard question, why don't you? Um, there's a lot of challenges. I mean, it's not going to be, I'm definitely not going to even add any value, but I'll give you my opinion. Regulating social media is a problem in its own, right? Because if you want to talk about, let's give an example of Twitter. When Twitter decides to say, for example, that this content that is being shared is not fitting with Twitter, is it who is Twitter? Is it the company, or is it the CEO who gets to say yes or no? And then there's also like the ability to create a random Twitter account with no real verification of a person to just go on and abuse and hurl abuse at people. Is that something that's also like, this is just one thing I'm talking about, just one thing called Twitter. Like, I'm not even touching YouTube. I'm not even touching Facebook. I'm not even like the big video based Twitter, for example, has become a place where you can have, I don't know how you can have debates on it because of the limits in the text, but people are having long conversations about serious topics that should never be had on Twitter, in my opinion. Like, it should just be a marketing thing. Here, watch this. Here, watch this. Here, watch this. But it's these long conversations and threads on a platform like that, where it's like, who is it for? If it's making it to your feed or not, then, why is it on your feed? Are you the right person to be viewing this? I don't know if I'm still in the youth bracket. I'm pretty sure I'm not after having kids. I think that I'm disqualified now from the youth. But it is the medium that people go to now for information. Like, we're living in the coronavirus right now, and there's e-learning. And there's not any learning. There's just E, and E is East, is Call of Duty, not
You brought
not listening to a conference about your teacher saying, "Oh, we have homework next week." Yeah, dude, I'm about to break. I'm about to rank. I'm gonna be the Fortnite legend amongst my friends this weekend. So you know what I mean? It's a bit, there are so many challenges, but I think a little bit of awareness of what each medium is doing and sharing that as awareness to all of them, to the eldest, starting with the eldest first, because it's a completely different generation. There's a new generation that's grown up with technology and with social media, have a completely different perspective. So more awareness on both sides, I think, is the first step.
You've asked some really important questions ranging from, what is Twitter and who really guides it, to what we really do when we're sitting in online classes. I think we're all being exposed here. So we have a professor with us on the panel, and I'm sure he can tell us a lot about what his students are up to in his class. Dr. Eddie, can you tell us a little about the challenges of media and social media? You know, things other than your students being on Instagram while they're in class, or they're meant to be in class on Zoom. Um, yeah, please add to this.
I think when you think of social media, journalism, or information, and you think of freedom of expression, for instance, um, it becomes a really interesting dichotomy because, on the one hand, you have the possibility um, for everyone to become the media. Okay, so everyone now can open a social media or a blog or whatever, and they can do their own stories. They can report their own stories. It is the first time in the history of society that we now are challenging things such as, I don't know, the fact that the Earth is spherical, for instance. It's the first time that we're challenging things that throughout history has never been challenged. So with everyone being able to become the media, and this is fantastic because in the 2000s, when the internet was the promise for the democratization of the media, what we started to see later is that a number of voices became very prominent. So now we have Breitbart. And what does that mean to to the media ecosystem? Is that when we had in the past a journalism that tended to be a little bit more surgical in the way in which they approach the stories, dispassionate. Now we have with social media is the amplification of emotions, and everything has become emotional to the point that information now is heavily polarized, to the point that, as Mariam was saying, you either are with me or against me. We have become a society where my opinion is more important than the facts. We have become a society where attention span is just reduced to the duration of a TikTok. And we have now journalists. There's a quite prominent journalist called Sophia Smith-Galler from BBC that she's able to condense a news story in 30 seconds for a TikTok. She's able to tell a whole story there. But of course, journalists are trying to adapt to the next technological marvel. And in the process, they are changing the behaviors of media consumers as well. So, we need to be really, it's one thing is freedom of the press and freedom of expression, but as well, we need to be quite aware of the responsibilities of the media.
Thank you, Professor. Some really important questions about where this is coming from and where this is going, and sort of the role that particular stories or particular mediums play in shaping our opinions and shaping our perspectives. And we haven't even gone through half of the questions that I had. I have a lot more questions, but I want to respect the time of our panelists. And I also want to give our audience an opportunity to engage with us, to ask us their questions, to give us their thoughts, and to give us their perspectives. So, audience, the floor is open to you. Ask us your questions, give us your perspectives, give us your thoughts, and engage with us. Whether you're watching on social media or you're watching us or engaging with us through Zoom, the floor is now yours.
Khansa, so there is a question to Ms. Mariam Dabhani. So, as a filmmaker covering areas in conflict, does being a female provide a particular set of advantages?
That's such an interesting question. I'm excited to hear about this. Mariam?
So it's actually both. So I get a set of advantages, but I also get a set of disadvantages. And as I said before, most of my work is basically going back home to Yemen and tell stories there. And although as a female, I get access to homes and speak to females, especially that a male journalist or a male filmmaker won't be able to do as freely, Because fortunately, back home, there is more appreciation for females and more given trust that I am able to enter a conservative society and still um, hear their heartfelt stories and be able to share them to the world as authentically as possible. However, due to the war, the past years, it's been extremely difficult for a female to move from a place to another alone. There is only two functioning airports. One is the international one. And if I want to travel from the current capital to the occupied capital, I need to have a male guardian. Without him, I will be questioned and held back and maybe harassed and arrested. This didn't used to be the case. Not even journalists. If a Yemeni female would like to move alone from one city to the other, whatever the need is, whether it's medical or to visit family or just life, she's not able to do that freely anymore. So there's always the two. So when I go back, I try to have a strategy for safety because safety is always important. Always, there is no story worth telling if you're not there to tell it. And I usually go back with my husband. He's kind of my team. So us together, we create this dynamic that we're trying to navigate both the advantages and disadvantages. But I hope that one day safety and security is established because why, as females, we always look at movement as a luxury. We're always scared for our lives. We're always interrogated, and it's 2021, and this is still happening.
I think that's such an important message to share because often people talk about sort of the glory of perhaps the fame that you might get or the importance of the stories that are being told, but I think your stories and your challenges are equally as important, and I hope that all of us utilize our platform to make it easier for people like you to tell us these stories, to tell us about these experiences, and I hope that it gets easier.
Thank you so much, Hamza. I really appreciate it.
Ms. Asil, do we have more questions?
Yes, there is another question on Facebook, and apologies to our audience for issues with live streaming on Facebook. There is an issue with Facebook itself, but now it's on. So there is a question: how can the public differentiate between fake news and real news, as there is a lot of fake news being used out there? Thank you.
Isn't this the real question? Dr. Eddie, would you like to get us started?
I think a lot of fact checkers and news organizations are starting to use artificial intelligence. Well, artificial intelligence, as if there was such a thing, but automation at least, to find ways of verifying information online and discriminating what could be fake and what could be what is was actually accurate information. But I do believe that back in if we go back to the 1920s when the media tended to be quite biased and politicized. It was a responsibility for the citizens to be informed and to be able to discern the kind of information that they want to consume. To me, it's pretty much the same. Look, it's not really difficult to do a couple of searches to make sure that the information that you're receiving, as outrageous as it sounds, it's and juicy and as it doesn't matter how much wish do you have of sharing it on social media. Do the responsible thing. Go have a look, do a couple of searches, look at it to see whether other verified mainstream news organizations are talking about the same before you kind of disseminate something that could be fake. I think ultimately we really need to up our game as citizens. And if all of us start just kind of doing what it is required to us, being a citizen is not just about demanding things. It's also about your responsibility within an ecosystem, within society. I'm sure that we're going to get rid of this.
Absolutely. And I love your answer. Often we try to look for this magical solution which will help us differentiate fake news from real news. But, the magical solution is us. We need to know enough about things to know what might be real and what might be fake, or know enough to have multiple sources where we can check from. So thank you so much. Ms. Asil, do we have any last question? We have time for one last question, I believe.
Yes. So the other question is, what should we be looking out for in the future with regard to free expression, especially as social media changes the way we consume and share and produce information?
All right. Hamad. Is the first question
What do you want to look out for? People, look out for people. We're the people. We're the problem. I mean, yeah, the information is what everyone's after, I guess, and social media just did some like weird things. And Instagram for me is, YouTube did one thing, and then Instagram did something that kind of blew up the whole world. And it's this sense of instant gratification. Everything is now. Everything is right now. I want my validation now. And if you want to use that in sense of the commercial sense, selling product and yourself and your ideas, and you're becoming an influencer, whatever that on steroids look like, that's what the future will bring. I mean, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. There's not enough information out there. You asked the question about fake news. I mean, I'll end with a story, and hopefully that will kind of, when the blockade was announced, I got phone calls from news outlets about what it means, for Qataris, what it means for Qatari government, and what it means. And I'm like, I'm a comedian, you know what I mean? I write jokes about people and politics sometimes, So coming to me for an answer about what the geopolitical situation is going to be and what this has an effect on, I'm not an economist. I'm not a politician. I don't know. Don't this is my thing to journalists. Pick the right person. Don't call me. I'm not going to be the one who's going to tell you the answer. That's kind of like fake news. If you ask me, that's what I do. I tell jokes. So if it gets to a point where it's just people surprise you. That's all I'm going to say. I'm just trying to keep it as politically correct as possible.
We don't know where it's going, is what I get from that. But there is a lot to look forward to in terms of good and both bad things alike. And I think we're all really excited about it. But let's try to keep ourselves more informed, as Dr. Eddie pointed out, and try to be more aware of what's happening around us, and make sure that we give more opportunities to people like Mariam who want to continue telling these stories. So thank you so much to our panelists for joining us today. We're grateful for your participation. I learned a lot, and there's a lot going around in my brain that I'd like to think more on and research more on. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for the US Embassy for giving us this platform to have this conversation. Don't forget to follow our social media. I promise we won't give you fake news, and but do follow us for more panels like this on other and interesting topics. And thank you for joining us.
So,
Thank you
you
for
so much.
having me.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for taking the time to be with us, and thanks for the feedback, which is really valuable.
Thank you so much, everyone.